On October 14th, 1842, Isaac Lewis Manning's younger sister, Jane Elizabeth Manning, received baptism into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at the hands of missionary Charles Wesley Wandell at New Canaan, Connecticut. There is no indication if Isaac attended his sister's baptism, but her enthusiasm for her newfound faith quickly spread among other Manning family members, including Isaac. As he later recalled, Jane heard the gospel and was baptized, and soon after, she got the whole family to be baptized. In December of that year, Albert Merrill, a Latter-day Saint leader of the local Norwalk, Connecticut congregation, baptized Isaac Manning and his wife Lucinda, likely on the same day. Unlike his sister Jane, however, Isaac left no record behind to indicate what attracted him to the new faith, but his baptism would nonetheless shape the rest of his life, perhaps in unexpected ways. Manning was an important early Black convert to the Latter-day Saint faith, alongside his much better-known younger sister, Jane Elizabeth Manning James. Within a year following his baptism in Connecticut, he traveled with Jane to Nauvoo, Illinois, but did not join her in Utah until 1892. He remained in the Midwest, living in Iowa, Michigan, and London, Ontario, Canada, where in 1876 he joined the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. After he moved to Utah, he was rebaptized into the Salt Lake City-based faith. He died there in 1911 as a highly regarded Latter-day Saint, especially because of his personal connection to Joseph Smith Jr. and his lifelong dedication to Smith's memory. More importantly, Isaac's recollections about his reception and work at the Nauvoo Mansion House provides an opportunity to test the racial vision that Joseph Smith articulates in Volume 2 of the Joseph Smith Papers journals against his actual treatment of people of Black African descent in practice. Scholars to date have scoured and scrutinized Joseph Smith's statements, as well as the books of scripture he produced, looking for evidence of racial priesthood or temple restrictions, or clues as to his stance on race. This paper, in contrast, assesses Joseph Smith's racial attitude from the vantage point of a personal connection to one Black convert. At Nauvoo, when Manning and his family arrived in late 1843, they were welcomed into the Joseph Smith household and allowed to stay at the Mansion House for at least a week while they found work and other accommodations. The warm welcome that Smith extended established a relationship of trust with the Manning family. As Jane remembered it, Smith said to the group, "God bless you. You are among friends now, and you will be protected." During their stay at the Mansion House, Jane said Smith came in every morning to see us and shake hands and know how we all were. Smith also ensured that Jane's clothing that was lost on the journey was replaced with new clothes, and he hired both Jane and Isaac to work at the Mansion House. Jane worked as a laundress and servant while Isaac served as cook. Late in life, in fact, Isaac recalled, "I was a cook in the prophet's kitchen at Nauvoo, and he used to say I was a mighty good cook too. I cooked the prophet's meals when I was servant in the family." It was more than being welcomed into the Smith home and working for him that captured Isaac's dedication, however. Isaac and his sisters Jane and Sarah all recalled late in life a sense of Smith's prophetic calling that captivated them and won their devotion. Jane claimed to have seen Smith in vision back in Connecticut, so that when she first met him in Nauvoo, she said, "I was certain he was a prophet because I knew it." Isaac and Jane's sister Sarah expressed a similar sentiment throughout her life. She was fond of saying, "You can just as easily make me believe that the sun never shone as that Joseph was not a prophet of God." Isaac likewise told a fellow Latter-day Saint that he knew Brother Joseph was a man of God, and he would have laid down his life for the prophet if he could have done so. Thus, the generous welcome the Manning family received, along with the continued kindnesses Smith showed family members, seems to have combined with what Isaac, Sarah, and Jane perceived to be a prophetic mantle to cement their commitment to the Latter-day Saint cause. For Isaac, the personal connection to Smith became a key aspect of his faith. Even still, the Manning family was a racial minority in a chiefly white faith. A small group of perhaps 25 Black people, many of whom were Latter-day Saints, both free and enslaved, had gathered with predominantly white converts from various locations in the United States, Canada, and Northern and Western Europe to form Nauvoo, a city of as many as 12,000 people. In January 1843, less than a year before Isaac and his family arrived at Nauvoo, Volume 2 of the Joseph Smith Papers Project journal series offers a glimpse into Joseph Smith's racial attitude. In response to a query regarding the situation of the Negro, Smith articulated an understanding grounded in racial equality. In his estimation, Black people were hampered by a lack of educational opportunities, not biological inferiority. Give them equal opportunity and they will rise to the same level or even higher than that of white people. Change their situation with the white and they will be like them, Smith claimed. They have souls and are subjects of salvation, he insisted, in contrast to some religious thinkers of his day. Even still, there were limits to Smith's racial openness. He did not preside over a racially egalitarian utopia by any stretch of the imagination. He allowed both white enslavers and Black enslaved people to be baptized, but insisted in 1835 that it was not right to interfere with bondservants, neither preach the gospel to nor baptize them contrary to the will and wish of their masters, nor to meddle with or influence them in the least, to cause them to be satisfied with their situation in this life. It was a declaration that grew out of accusations in Missouri that Latter-day Saints had invited free Black Mormons to that state in order to incite a slave rebellion. Smith also spoke out against the immediate abolitionist movement in 1836 in an effort to assuage fears that Latter-day Saints favored racial abolitionism and the closely associated assumption that if a person favored immediate emancipation, then he really supported race mixing. By 1844, however, Smith moved in a different direction. He advocated for what he called national equalization between the races, an idea that he failed to define or implement. He also promoted gradual emancipation and government-funded compensation to enslavers for the loss of property that the freeing of slaves would represent. Smith nonetheless opposed interracial marriage and suggested that strict laws should confine Black people to their own species. As for priesthood ordination, free Black men were not universally ordained under Smith's leadership, but neither were white men. There is no evidence, for example, that Isaac or any male members of the Manning group who arrived at Nauvoo were ordained to the priesthood. Lack of ordination, however, did not automatically signal that Smith somehow prevented them from receiving the priesthood or that he had implemented a racial priesthood policy by the time the Manning family settled in Nauvoo. Priesthood ordination in the 19th century Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was not universal among white male members, let alone among Black men. Ordination was not automatic and certainly not as systematic as it became by the early 20th century. In Nauvoo and elsewhere in the 1830s through the 1860s, evidence suggests that most men were not ordained. Enough men were ordained in each congregation to ensure organizational function, but no more. In a survey of 27 congregations through 1868, including one Salt Lake City-based ward, the majority of men, regardless of race, were not ordained to the priesthood. In 1842, for example, the 14 congregations scattered across New Jersey, Delaware, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania included 862 total members, of which only 72 held priesthood offices. Unfortunately, the reported statistics do not break down membership by gender or age, but even if we estimate that half the membership was male and half the male members were children, that would still mean that only 72 out of an estimated 216 men held priesthood office, or about 1/3. The primary purpose of ordination was to provide each congregation with a leadership structure and to fill church staffing needs, not to see that all worthy males held priesthood office. The majority of white men in these examples were not ordained, an assessment that makes the ordination of at least a few Black men in the first 2 decades of the Latter-day Saint movement that much more remarkable. It also means that Manning's lack of ordination after his arrival at Nauvoo is not an indication of a racial restriction at play or even anything out of the ordinary. After Smith's warm welcome and a week of finding accommodations and work, Manning settled into life at Nauvoo. Manning's principal job was cook at the mansion house, but according to belated remembrances, he found a variety of other ways to contribute to community life at Nauvoo. He quarried stone for the temple then under construction. He He taught a dance school at the Masonic Hall, and he joined the Nauvoo Legion, the city's militia unit, or more precisely, its band. Manning's most significant memory at Nauvoo, however, involved more tragic circumstances. Following the violent death of Joseph and Hiram Smith at Carthage, Manning remembered being asked to dig 2 graves in the Nauvoo cemetery as decoys, where caskets loaded with sand were then buried following a public ceremony. Latter-day Saint leaders were fearful that those who disliked the saints would dig up the bodies of the 2 slain men and desecrate them, hence the decoys. The actual bodies were then buried in the basement of the unfinished Nauvoo house. Within months of the murders, tension between Emma and Brigham Young over who controlled what property prompted Emma to secretly move the bodies from the church-owned Nauvoo house to the southwest corner of Joseph and Emma's homestead. Manning dug the graves for this second resting place, this time in the cellar of an outbuilding close to what he called the Prophet's old log house on the banks of the river. Manning thus dug a total of 4 graves for the bodies of the Smith brothers, 2 decoy graves, and 2 for the burial at the Smith homestead. His service in behalf of the 2 men whom he revered remained a source of satisfaction to him for the rest of his life. It was such an important memory for Manning and such an intimate and significant connection to Joseph and Hiram Smith that in 1903 he wrote a signed declaration of his role in digging the 4 graves. Manning's statement, although brief and absent a sense of chronology, matches perfectly with recent scholarship on the remains of the Smith brothers, a fact that validates his memory. As he recalled, "To whom it may concern, Isaac Lewis Manning declares in truth that in the year 1844, in the city of Nauvoo, after the prophet and patriarch was killed, William Huntington called on me to dig the graves to bury their remains. I dug the graves in the prophet's old log house on the banks of the river. I dug them in the cellar. I also dug 2 in the burying ground, but the bodies were buried in the cellar. There were 2 extra coffins got and put in the burying ground to fool the mob, and as far as I know, their bodies were never removed. They were buried at night, but I was not there." Isaac L. Manning. In sum, Manning's statement solidifies existing evidence regarding the burials of Joseph and Hiram Smith, as well as indicates the significant role that these 2 men played in Manning's memory. For the rest of his life, Manning cherished the service he performed for the slain bodies of the person he claimed as a prophet and his brother, the patriarch. In the 2 years following the deaths of Hiram and Joseph, Isaac Manning and the rest of the Manning family separated from Jane Manning. Jane married Isaac James, a black convert from New Jersey who had also gathered to Nauvoo, and the new couple moved with Brigham Young and his followers to the Great Basin in 1847. Whatever the reasons, Manning and his brother Peter and his sisters Sarah and Angeline, along with his mother Phyllis, did not join his sister Jane in the main body of Latter-day Saints as they left Nauvoo in 1846 and migrated to the Great Basin. Sometime in the mid-1870s, Manning moved to London, Ontario, Canada, where he and his 4th wife, Rachel Ann Bryan, were baptized into the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They worshiped together in the London, Ontario branch and lived close to Isaac's brother Peter and his wife. That is where Joseph Smith III found them in 1878 when he traveled to Canada to survey the condition of the RLDS church there. As Smith later recalled, "After the dispersion from Nauvoo, I lost sight for a time of this Isaac Manning and also of his brother Peter. Years later, upon the occasion of a visit to London, Ontario, I met them both." There is no indication that Isaac Manning was aware of the possibility of priesthood ordination when he was baptized into the reorganized church. Even though the RLDS church ordained black men to its priesthood, like the LDS church, it did not practice universal male ordinations, and thus Manning may not have expected to receive the priesthood in either tradition. Regardless, Manning was not ordained to the RLDS priesthood. After losing his wife and only son to death, Isaac eventually moved to Salt Lake City to join his last surviving sister, Jane Manning James. James welcomed her older brother into her home in downtown Salt Lake City, and a year later, Manning decided to align his faith with that of his sister. On March 28, 1893, L.A. Wilson baptized Manning into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for the second time in his life. Unfortunately, it is impossible to know what reasoning went into Manning's decision or what discussions he and James may have had over his prior baptism into the RLDS Church, or about race and faith more generally. His rebaptism into the LDS faith would not have required him to give up priesthood because he was not ordained into the RLDS priesthood. Nonetheless, his sister was all too aware of the restrictions to full Black participation that had been put in place in the LDS faith under Brigham Young, and that had assumed growing precedent under succeeding leaders. It is difficult to imagine that she did not tell Manning about the racial policies that were hardening in place, at least in part in response to her ongoing appeals to receive her temple rituals and the repeated rejection she received from LDS leaders. Manning, nonetheless, chose to again commit himself to the same religious tradition he had embraced in 1842. This time, racial restrictions were in place, and yet Manning still opted to enter the waters of baptism as a symbol of his rebirth in Christ and pledge himself anew to the faith that his sister never left. Manning had joined James in the Salt Lake City LDS 8th Ward, where she had found a sense of belonging among the women in her congregation and had worshiped for the last 2 decades. In the final years of both of their lives, the brother and sister duo became highly regarded members of the Latter-day Saint community and pioneer celebrities of sorts, especially because they both represented living connections to Joseph Smith. James and Manning were given prominent and reserved seats in the Salt Lake Tabernacle, near the front in the center of the building, where the Deseret News reported that Jane made cushions for the seats, and the old couple and their friends had the exclusive rights to the seats. Most of the accounts that mention Manning and James did so because of their connection to Joseph Smith and because they were Black pioneers, an anomaly in an increasingly white church. One report, for example, called them well-known colored residents, while another stated that Manning was said to have dug the grave for the remains of Joseph Smith. An 1899 feature story announced that Auntie Jane and Uncle Isaac, as they were sometimes called, are 2 delightfully typical old colored people who enjoyed the privilege of living in the family of the prophet Joseph Smith and who glory in telling all about it. Manning fondly recalled that Smith received them into his household, where Manning presided over the culinary department of the prophet's establishment. Manning's personal connection to Smith was certainly one of the reasons reporters sought him out in the first place. In a church that so thoroughly revered its founding prophet, the tie to Smith offered Manning a level of esteem he otherwise may not have had. Brigham Young had defied Manning's race as theologically cursed, but in emphasizing his personal link to Smith, Manning was able to circumvent that curse, even if only in the press. When interviewed, Manning tended to recall the way that Smith accepted him and his family into the mansion house and offered him a job. In the 1899 interview, Manning was not merely a cook, but he presided over the culinary department of the prophet's establishment, an indication that Smith trusted him and even allowed him to preside. There were no racial barriers in Manning's retellings. Instead, he focused on the relationship with Smith that allowed him to highlight the church's earlier universalism without ever directly mentioning the priest or temple restrictions. Manning died in a Salt Lake City hospital on April 13, 1911, of pericarditis, an inflammation of the sac surrounding his heart. He was 1 month shy of his 96th birthday. Newspapers throughout Utah ran stories of his death, all of which highlighted his connection to Joseph Smith. Manning's life as a Latter-day Saint had spanned nearly 70 years and included 3 baptisms into 2 different churches that claimed Joseph Smith as founding prophet. Manning left few clues as to what his commitment to the 2 restoration traditions meant to him, but the central theme that survives is his devotion to the memory of Joseph Smith and the personal connections he felt to the man he considered to be a prophet of God. That connection lasted a lifetime and is the most discernible source of his dedication to the Latter-day Saint cause. On one occasion, after moving to Salt Lake City, Manning told a fellow Latter-day Saint that he hoped to live so that he could meet the prophet and be with him on the other side. When news reporters called on him late in life to talk about his recollections, Manning frequently mentioned working as a cook for Joseph and Emma at the mansion house and digging the graves for Joseph and Hiram. In 1899, when the Salt Lake Herald interviewed Manning, he also recalled that the prophet's goodness to them when they arrived in Nauvoo, almost perfect strangers, and noted that Joseph Smith treated them with the best his house afforded. Over 50 years later, Smith's warm welcome and generosity still captivated Manning. Smith had honored Manning and his family with the dignity of food, clothing, shelter, and jobs when they arrived at Nauvoo, and Manning did not forget. Perhaps it was no coincidence that Manning used language that echoed the New Testament when he spoke of the reception Joseph Smith provided to almost perfect strangers. Smith modeled a central Christian teaching, and that fact stuck in Manning's mind for the rest of his life. I was a stranger, and you took me in, Manning seemed to recall. I was hungry and thirsty, and you offered me the best your house could afford. It was no wonder then that Manning proudly declared in 1903, 59 years after the fact, that after the prophet and patriarch was killed, I dug the graves. The 4 graves that he dug were his gift, his memorial, his labor of love, his evidence of faith, his personal connection to Joseph Smith, and his enduring legacy as a lifelong Latter-day Saint. Thank you.